Hello everybody and welcome to today's IEP Live Learn Lunch. Really excited to be joined today by one of the fellows of the IEP, Dan Finn, Emeritus Professor of Social Inclusion. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Finn, who's going to take us through today's session.
Hi, and assuming that everybody can now hear me, and I'm going to go through this presentation. Look, at the work this is based on is, ironically, there's a kind of symmetry here. It's I did a number of projects for the International Labour Organization, who I'm going to explain their role in employment service partnerships in a bit. But they commissioned me to review a lot of the work they've done in developing countries on the evolution of partnership working between public employment services on the one hand, and a wide range of partner organisations on the others, especially private recruitment and employment agencies and employment services and training subcontractors. And that work culminated in reports, which is referenced at the end of the presentation, and there's a hyperlink in it, which may or may not work for people, I don't know, we'll find out afterwards. And I kind of gave the presentation to that, the first major fellows meeting of the IEP just before the pandemic. Subsequently, the ILO have been undertaking a major review of the role of the public employment service internationally, and are aiming to publish it later this year. And as part of that work, they asked me to update the work I'd done on partnerships and how the role the partnerships were playing, employment service partnerships were playing during the pandemic. And so to some extent, this is me trying to synthesize that information and hopefully provide something that's useful and some context for the people who are joining the presentation. Okay, and so broadly it's going to be about what is partnership working, how does it work, what was the role during the pandemic, and how do we make it work better, basically. Okay, so it's been a key feature. There have been lots of reviews of the ways in which different countries responded to COVID-19 and are still responding to the pandemic, because, you know, much as we'd like to think it's not actually over, and other countries are more or less dealing with peaks and troughs in infection rates and various types of lockdowns, furlough arrangements, etc. But essentially, at the heart of the responses of different countries, the employment service was playing a critical kind of role in the mobilisation of new types of interventions and services for people and employers affected by the recession. And typically, labour ministries and or public employment services themselves utilised existing or created new partnerships and collaborations and contracts to address the impacts of this multifaceted crisis. So the key institutions involved in this, and to some of the, to quite a few of this will be very obvious, but I just want to make it clear, and some of the framework within which employment services are delivered and partnerships work. The key organisation in most countries is a public employment service. And I'll talk a bit about the different types of public employment services and why they operate in different ways. Alongside that is a growing and burgeoning network and sector of private and temporary work agencies. That's both growing as labour markets have become more flexible, particularly in advanced economies, but also become more open in other economies, play a really kind of significant role in international recruitment and migration and things like that. But also there's been a massive expansion in how they operate as a result of the digital explosion that's taken place in terms of how services are organised, delivered, and how people are actually working. Alongside that sector, there are then the direct partnerships, service delivery partnerships within the public employment services, and a network of for-profit and non-profit organisations, which you'll find in most countries, many of the countries that I've studied. I just want to kind of say a wee bit about the role of the International Labour Organization. It's the oldest of these multilateral organizations. The UK still has some role in relationship to it, but what the conventions do of the ILO is essentially set the kind of normative framework within which employment services operate internationally, and through within which international organizations themselves talk about and think about and reference the activities of the employment service. There are some really important conventions. For example, it's out of the ILO that basic principles that job seekers shouldn't be charged for job seeking by the public sector, that employers shouldn't have to pay for job placement directly for job placement services. Things like that have actually emerged over the years. And this normative framework is very important, especially so in developing countries where it has more traction than maybe it does in some of the advanced countries. The UK, I added these to the overheads I shared previously. You'll see that the 1919 Convention, which is the only one that technically is in force in the UK at the moment, has a commitment that both where public and private employment agencies exist, steps should be taken to coordinate the operations of such agencies on a national scale. And to some extent, that's reflected in the long-standing national partnership arrangements that an organisation like the Recruitment and Employers Confederation has with Job Centre Plus about vacancy handling, intelligence sharing, and so on. There's also the Employment Services Convention 1948, which was very important in establishing the principle of a free public employment service within the context of the commitment in many countries to full employment, but also set the normative framework within which the assumption was that the public employment service should be wholly delivered by public sector agencies and largely by public servants. That influence and that shaping has been revised in the 1997 Convention, which recognised the need for partnerships. But in many countries, there's still a strong residual kind of element that the employment service is delivered primarily through the public sector. But we can maybe consider that in a bit. Working with other organisations in a whole range of different countries, how the public employment service works, its autonomy, its funding, etc., is shaped by different governance arrangements and by its relationship with employer organisations and trade unions. And then below that, between the relationship between the employment service and regional and local government and other stakeholders at those subnational and local kind of levels. As I mentioned, the traditional PES was evolved as a public sector monopoly, supported by that ILO convention, but that has now dissipated in many countries, and increasingly what we're seeing is a more active support and encouragement of partnership working between the public employment service and other labour market intermediaries, as well as a wider range of complementary service providers who, particularly when employment services are working with more disadvantaged clients, need to be mobilised or linked with to develop the services that people need. In the jargon in Europe, albeit the UK is out of Europe, except for the little bit that I'm stuck in, which is Northern Ireland, there's a significant conceptual change taking place, and the language within the European Union has shifted towards the idea of moving away from a singular public sector organisation towards a wider, the notion of employment services as wider public employment ecosystem, where the public employment service or the relevant ministry acts to conduct and coordinate these different actors in the labour market. And that's within that framework that partnership working is critical to how the public employment service or how modern employment services are delivered and organised. And my contention, I think some of the evidence bears this out, this is not a place where there's hard evidence in the sense of randomized controlled trials or that kind of evidence-based work. But my contention would be that the success of the PERS is often shaped by how well it works with other stakeholders and how it coordinates its activities with other labour market intermediaries and complementary service providers. Okay. So what is partnership working? So it's essentially, it constitutes the multiple ways in which the PERS, the Public Employment Service, collaborates with a wide range of other organisations and agencies in order to achieve its strategic and labour market objectives. It covers both the method of working as well as the form that that working can take. And if we look at the PERS in pretty well every country, developing countries and developed countries, it's a bit more sparse in the LDCs. But what we find is that there's a mix of national and or regional strategic and or service delivery partnerships. And this partnership working can be collaborative or contractual. And one of the interesting things in the developing countries that I was looking at is the way in which the Ministry and the Public Employment Service in a number of countries was actively supporting the development and the capacity of external organisations to be able to play a role in the delivery of employment services, particularly on the non-profit side, the activities of NGOs, but also working imaginatively with some of the private providers, the for-profit providers of digital and online and telephone app services. And finally, of course, partnership work can be top-down. It can be mandated by the central government, the ministry, and by the PERS nationally, or it can be bottom-up. And this is where many of the responses to the pandemic were very evident and are crucial also in terms of responding more generally to the types of labour market crises that the employment service plays a critical role in responding to, particularly when that involves large-scale redundancies on the more negative side, but also on the more positive side, large-scale recruitment activities, investments in particular communities and in particular kind of areas. Okay, so that's kind of a general kind of overview of why PERS partnership working is really important, who the actors are involved, and what's actually included. Now, as I've explained to the hosts of the organisation, I can talk about this stuff for hours, but I thought I'd just stop for a couple of minutes before I go on to some of the case, to briefly discuss some case studies, just to see if anybody wanted to come in with any comments or if anybody's been feeding back into the chat.
We don't have any questions at the moment, but we can encourage people to, if you have any questions, please do ask them. Or if you want to, you can pop your hand up and we can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question. They're being a bit shy, which isn't unusual, Dan, when we first go to them for questions. Please do know that you can at any point pop something in the chat and we will put that to Dan, or you can raise your hands and myself or Emma will come to you.
And it isn't mandatory, so don't worry if you ain't answering. It's just weird doing a remote kind of digital presentations where you can't even see faces. It's a strange one. But also look at the end of the presentation, as I said, there's a bunch of references. In particular, if people can't access the hyperlinks and are interested in following up on this, then it's very easy to find my email address and to contact me directly, and I can fire off this and also maybe respond to anybody who's got a particular kind of query.
Excellent, thank you. Okay,
so most of the studies of partnership working and partnership activity of employment services are particularly kind of European focused or Anglo focused. They're at the developed country kind of level. the ILO, and again, for those of you who are interested in following up on this, the ILO, although the website's a bit clunky, in the ILO there is a host of materials from the research base through to the more practically focused about how to run a job centre, for example, or how to train up frontline workers. There's a raft of publications there, which is a really good and valuable kind of resource. Anyways, they were interested and have a particular emphasis on the role that partnership working can play in actually enabling developing countries to, especially middle-income countries, to develop public employment services as they liberalise their labour markets and have moved towards more open markets and more urban kind of labour markets. And so one of the things we did as part of this work was to look at a number of the different ways in which national governments had actually encouraged partnership working in different countries. And these countries were selected in a sense partly because of their scale, but also because they were doing interesting things. This is in the period prior to the pandemic, probably between about 2010, 2019. So one model that we looked at was in Colombia, and this is not unique in the Latin American context, but Peru has got a very similar kind of approach, where essentially what the national government did was to create a specialist unit inside the ministry, partly separate from a traditional training and skills agency, which was seen as fairly, moribund's too strong a word, but was very conventional, very traditional, wasn't very imaginative. And this national delivery agency started to develop the idea of a national service model, and has essentially created a network of licensed both public and private providers who are part of what is there called the network. And the network has an IT base to it, has placement functions, and has certain minimum kind of requirements which lots of different organizations sign up to, and also uniquely has access to some specialist funds in the country, which mean that new services can be developed through this network for previously disadvantaged groups. And in the context of Colombia, some very interesting work around providing support for displaced people who've been displaced by the conflict in Colombia. Echoes of what will be happening in Eastern Europe and places like that, as well throughout Europe, as we've been accommodating and responding to both the crisis in Syria and the Middle East, but also now in Ukraine. In India, they've essentially adapted, and old A4E colleagues were involved in this to some extent back in the day. But essentially what India has done is tried to mirror and learn from the National Career Service in the UK, and has created a National Career Service as a new model within which it wants its about 1,000 employment exchanges to actually adapt and modernise their service delivery. And this involves both a national online job vacancy matching, a service delivery portal, alongside a new model office, which is being rolled out in about 100 parts of 100 areas in India, with particular focus on tackling youth unemployment, which is run by local partnerships, particularly between employers and state government or local government, with some small startup funds from the centre. Interestingly, also in India, it's the only country that I know of which has a mandatory corporate social responsibility levy, which employers have to pay. And some of that money can be channeled and used by those employers in the establishment of these new modern career centres, as they're called. Finally, China, vast. The numbers, both of job seekers and in people in employment, is boggling. But also is the number of people in the employment services sector now. But essentially, as China, dealing with incredible variations in terms of levels of economic development, from the Shanghais of this world to the remotely populated parts of Mongolia or Lower Mongolia. But essentially what it's doing is promoting partnerships with external providers as one of the ways of actually rapidly building capacity so that it can actually adjust to the pretty fundamental labour market changes that have been taking place in the country, obviously since the move away from state-directed kind of communism through now to the more kind of rapid changes of people moving from country to city, etc., etc. And there are a lot of, in the reports that the ILO have commissioned, lots of interesting examples about how those local partnerships have operated in individual cities or in individual areas. Saudi Arabia is another very interesting one because that one has been explicitly driven by a strategy of inviting in international providers, in particular Ingeus, which was there, or Ingeus Deloitte as it then was from day one, to actually develop a network of job placement centres and to create a national public sector delivered online portal supplemented by contracting out job placement centres which work with harder to place job seekers in the Saudi kind of context. And again, very interestingly, most of those contracts have now moved much more towards performance-based contracts, which people are familiar with now in the context both of Australia and the UK in terms of how contractual partnerships are organised. And finally, South Korea, which was chosen, I guess, because it was an example of a country that had been through a rapid phase of economic development. It was now a modern kind of economy, and the types of partnerships that it was providing and developing through its public employment service and its local areas. And again, there's a raft of those. One of the areas that people might be interested in following up on is that there's a very specific focus on improving and increasing the employment rate of women in the context of South Korea, a particular issue in many South Asian countries. And that's led to the development of specific kind of women's employment centres, which again usually represent kind of partnerships between local government, the National Public Employment Service, and specialist NGOs and women's skills and training institutes. And again, so what we can see there is the evolution of a number of different types of strategies for actually trying to make partnerships work. Okay, so that was the kind of the background and the context in which the crisis emerged. And what we see very quickly is that as countries were responding to the crisis and developing new services and new labour market programs, new types of income support, what we happened, again, contention would be that the countries with more established patterns of partnership working, where these relationships were better developed, were in a much better position to more quickly respond to the challenges of and labour market shocks induced by the pandemic. So they reinforced, as well as existing new and creative partnership workings, and that partnerships continue to play a role. The next slide is basically, this is from the new report that should be coming out this year. And it's a fairly simple kind of report where one of the chapters will be looking at partnership working. And this was just a survey of, I think it was about 70 public employment services responded, and about the types of services they were developing or had developed in response to the pandemic as a way of kind of dealing with the labour market and health-related consequences of it. And not surprising, we can see the most frequent one mentioned is obviously the relationships with employers to solve crisis-related workforce and recruitment needs, partnerships with other organisations working with the unemployed and providing temporary income support. And again, some of these things won't be surprising. The two of the key areas I just want to focus on very briefly, one is the impact on digital services, and the second one is the relationship between the employment service and what in the jargon is broadly described as social protection systems, which provide income support, both temporary and full-time, to people in desperate need during related crises. Okay, so it's clear that, again, you know, the technologies were there and have now been accelerated because of the pandemic. The move to remote service delivery, which is still common in many countries, although more blended now with more in-touch service delivery. Key features were collaboration between private digital employment and intermediation services who were helping to expand PES coverage and capacity. And classically, there are things like in Malaysia, they've been doing a lot of work, and it just arrived just on stream as the pandemic hit. A new My Future Jobs portal, which a Dutch related agency provides all the technical kind of support and advice and guidance of, and the My Future Jobs portal was quickly interlinked with income support and unemployment insurance systems over there, providing a digital framework within which the country could respond to the needs generated by the pandemic. Much acceleration of partnerships between the PES and vocational skills platforms. In India, for example, there's some good examples of companies like Tata and the new National Career Service, which I mentioned, working in partnerships to provide online services for people, through to some of the case studies generated by the European networks involving, for example, the Greek Public Employment Service doing similar types of online partnerships with Google and Coursera. Again, this kind of reinforced the need for greater partnership working with providers of digital inclusion services. Again, a critical kind of issue still, notwithstanding, you know, as we make the full transition to universal credit, which still really hasn't happened for those many people in work on tax credits and on disability benefits, which is just literally just starting again at the moment in the managed migration process. And finally, digital technologies themselves facilitate partnership working. They make the coordination and networking of service delivery much more feasible, both on the management side and on the service delivery side. Not without its problems, from data sharing through to service protocols and what have you. But again, there's been they're providing more and more of the digital base on which greater service coordination and partnership working can be developed. And that's worked its way through in terms of how different countries organise their services. And a great example is from the Workforce Development Boards in the United States, where they now have a national network of American job centres, which basically coordinate and co-locate a whole range of related employment services and income support services, so that service users and employers can access more joined up services. The second dimension I wanted to highlight was the link with social protection programs. And, you know, that is as simple as getting more money into people's pockets quickly in a way that's efficient and not subject to too much kind of fraud, through to what we're finding, and the latest work that I've been involved in is what we're now seeing, and this is World Bank rather than ILO, is that in a whole range of countries, emergency income supports had to be introduced, particularly when when they went into national lockdowns. They needed kind of furlough systems of one sort or another. And a whole range of countries are now starting to say we need to organise things on a more permanent kind of basis. So we have these absorbers for our countries in the future. And just really interestingly, from my point of view, a category which I'd not been aware of before, but basically a category called small island states, which are countries which are often at risk of the consequences of global warming through to natural climate disasters, typhoons, etc., and also pandemic and economic shocks, and now seeking to develop employment services alongside the introduction of unemployment benefit systems. So what we see is, examples of the co-location of employment service and social assistance services, and cooperation targeted at particular disadvantaged client groups or localities. And again, in terms of service delivery, one of the most common kind of aspects and results of partnership working is the increasingly joined up frontline delivery of employment services with other related services. In the jargon, often referred to as single window services or one-stop services, but basically involving the co-location and coordination of services. In the UK, the most obvious example has been more recent move from on behalf of Job Centre Plus towards youth hubs, and also things like the Women's Employment Centres, which I mentioned in South Korea. Okay. Again, I just wondered if people wanted the chance to ask any questions on that quick trot around the globe on services and partnerships.
So we have had a couple of questions come in earlier on, so I'll read those to you. So the first question we had was, Dan, did you observe any key differences in the collaborative versus contractual partnerships?
Yep. So very much so, and the relationship tends to be a different one. Obviously, the collaborative one can sometimes be mandated, so it's not just that there's a spectrum of the types of partnership working and the levels at which it kinds of takes place. So on one level, collaborative can be simple, mutually agreed, the mutual agreement of a service delivery arrangement, such as again has existed between Job Centre Plus and the REC organisation in the UK, where there's a commitment to coordinate and coordinate about intelligence about what's happening in the labour market, as well as develop protocols about how, for example, vacancies should be shared or displayed on Job Centre on DWP websites and things like that, through to the more traditional hierarchical kind of contract, which is simply the pairs buying a service, a specific, clearly defined service from organisations where it's very much a top-down rather than collaborative kind of relationship. What I would say is those two extremes, from completely voluntary to completely collaborative, there's a raft of differences in the middle of them. The crucial thing to me about the nature of contractual relationships is where they're found to work best, I think, they generate also new types of partnership working between the contractor and the organisations that have to deliver the services for them. They can't simply be contracts written down on paper. They're active lived documents and lived relationships that have to be managed and that involve types of working which aren't simply what's in the kind of contract. And we see that especially in the way DWP contracts have evolved over the last 10 years, where a greater emphasis on the part of the department on providers to work in partnerships, to acknowledge the role of partnerships, and sometimes to hand funding down to local partnerships, as has happened in Manchester and London in terms of the particular programs that went alongside, was it WorkChoice? I lose contact with the different kind of names, but essentially, the devolution of budgets to the Manchester Devolved Authority and in the London Devolved Authority, who then create their own contractual relationships with others. So yeah, very important kind of differences. The crucial thing, I guess, about the collaborative ones is on many levels, they can be voluntary. But as I said, there's also a specific train where central government mandates partnership working between different organisations, public sector organisations typically, to deliver services. And these tend to get reflected on the ground, as in, say, United States in these workforce, also the American job centres, where you'll find a series of memorandums of understanding or service level agreements between organisations that are mandated to share their services and to co-locate their services in these American kind of job centres. So a spectrum of different types of relationships, but one I think where the thread of partnerships as a way of working works its way through the different collaborative and contractual forms.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So Joe's asked, is there any learning that could be translated to the UK at all? Thinking particularly about the slightly quixotic relationships between JCP and the rest of the employment services ecosystem, and how this tends to rely on local relationships.
Yeah, but here we're back to some of the stuff of how governance arrangements affect what partnership working means and how it can operate in different local kind of contexts. And one of the unresolved tensions, I think, in the approach of the DWP to partnership working is that, notwithstanding the language has changed and notwithstanding, I think, some of the impulse is better, but it's still very much a partnership arrangement which works on the basis of we will partner with you if you get to do the things we want you to do, rather than a relationship which is mutual, where people co-share and develop shared objectives. And I think that kind of partnership working is struggling to emerge within England and Wales, England especially, I think, albeit it's more advanced in those parts of the country where we've got devolved combined authorities, particularly under the role of mayors at the moment. And again, I think places like Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, the big urban areas have those kind of arrangements. And again, the Levelling Up white paper in the UK nods towards this with the pilots it wants to support. But I still think there's that fundamental tension between a top-down, target-driven national public sector organisation working horizontally with organisations that want to work with DWP that don't necessarily share the same objectives, or that there needs to be a negotiation about what those shared objectives may be. A classic one would be, for me, is the local kind of emphasis in many partnerships in the United Kingdom on meeting the needs of all their residents who are unemployed, not just benefit claimants. And one of the problems for DWP is all of its programs and approaches are driven by the benefit recipiency, by and large, of the populations it prioritises.
Excellent, thank you. So I have another question for you. Some say that contracts may incentivise providers to offer services to clients who are more likely to enter work unaided, so in brackets, dead weight. Does this apply to pairs partnerships as well, and how can this be avoided?
Yeah, I think, I guess essentially we're talking about the kind of problems of creaming and parking.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, which is, the notion that providers will seek to work with those job seekers or participants who are most likely to get jobs. And why wouldn't they? Works for the provider, works for the job seeker. But also they might do that in a way that's at the expense of more disadvantaged job seekers who may be parked and received a minimal service or a less than full-on service because they're perceived to be harder to kind of place. I think there is plenty of evidence of that in terms of poorly designed contracts, yeah? And I think there are contractual mechanisms and there are ways in which some of that negative incentive can be diminished. And it's interesting, it'll be very interesting, sorry, this is again getting into the jargon, but it'll be very interesting to see if the accelerator model inside the new prime contracts that DWP has let with the with Restart and the preceding. I keep wanting to call it work choice, and I know AIM, the working health program. That's what I meant. Whether that's made a difference. That was a kind of, a nice little technical fix which said we'll pay more for based on the cohort of job seekers you get in rather than on individual kind of job seekers. So it's sought to kind of minimise creaming and parking in that kind of way. My own view is that I think there are always limited resources, both in terms of frontline advisor time through to the number of vacancies that are actually available. So there's always some kind of sorting mechanism going on within what employment service providers do, whether it's voluntary, involuntary, whether it's contractual or non-contractual. And I think the thing is that can be sharpened and made worse by poorly designed contracts, and there's plenty of evidence that haven't taken place. Equally, it can be driven by poorly designed target regimes in non-commercial relationships, as has happened in previous iterations of Job Centre Plus kind of activity. So my own view is that this is a constant issue that needs to be tackled, and the best way of tackling it is by having clear insight into what's actually happening to people on the ground, service users on the ground. And the most critical instrument there, I think, has been the use of customer feedback and surveys of people once they've left programs. And it's, again, I think a really good move, although it was a really bad move when the DWP abandoned it. But it's a good move that the Restart program has actually introduced some idea of a participant service. At least we can get some independent insight into how the service users themselves perceive the level of service they've been receiving.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any particular lessons you can share with us in how to achieve maximum benefits from collaboration between PES and the private sector?
Particular lessons. I mean, to be honest, I'd suggest, I'd encourage people obviously to look at the report and look at the kind of exec summaries of what tries to be articulated in there. I think there's no kind of simple answer to, or simple lessons, couldn't you do it? There are a lot of lessons about, on the one hand, the contracting side, about good and bad contract design. On the other hand, about good and bad service level agreements, good and bad MOUs, and about the ways in which people work and operate locally. I think one of the key lessons I would say is that it's something that providers need to take very seriously, both at the employer-focused end of what they do, as many providers do. They will have specialist staff. In the American jargon, the idea of job developers, people who go out, seek vacancies, build relationships with employers, build partnerships with employers that are appropriate to the client groups that you're delivering services for, through to the managers and service planners who, as part of the framework of skills and ways in which they work, need to have partnership working, relationship building as part of the tools and skills that they exhibit and are able to kind of reflect in how they organise their local services and try to make them work better, both alongside other local services, but crucially to deliver better coordinated services for the people they're actually working with. And it's there's a big tension still between, I think, culturally on the ground in the UK about non-profit and for-profit organisations and about perceptions about different motives. But I think those can be overcome with commitment.
Excellent, thank you. Interesting. Okay, so I've got one final question for you. I don't know if anyone else has. That's all the questions we've had in the chat. So if anyone else would like to ask a question, if you don't want to type it, it's absolutely fine to raise your hands and I can come to you and unmute you. But do you have any particular advice on how PES can develop effective vacancy sharing arrangements between PES and TWAs?
And again, I think this is one of the key things here. garble, garble, garble. Trying to be clear about it. Okay, very important on a national basis that there are protocols between the public and private sector about, what a vacancy is, what's legitimate, how it gets advertised. If nothing else, on a labour standards thing to kind of stop exploitation and stop people being exposed to both charlatan agencies or pretend employers who want to get money out of them, through to that the jobs on offer are actually worthwhile for people and also non-exploitative on a whole raft of different kind of dimensions. So that kind of thing is pretty important, and I think is going to be increasingly important as the digital world continues to expand. And crucially here, I think one of the exciting things in the number of the countries I looked at, particularly this was the case in India, was about the way in which the national job portal that the public sector, the ministry had developed, or the National Career Service had developed, and the relationships it was building with a whole raft of both temporary work agencies as well as international labour exchange, labour recruitment agencies, through to just private recruitment agencies, as well as different kinds of service providers. And there were, for those relationships to work, you obviously need kind of protocols about how they would happen, what's acceptable and what's kind of not. But I think that's a really kind of exciting and interesting area to develop. One of my fears, again, this is I was trying to find out and I couldn't today, was about EURES, which I thought used to be one of the kind of good aspects of being part of Europe, which was the sharing, which still is part of Europe and the existing member states, which is the practical kind of cooperation and coordination that existed between public employment services in terms of vacancy sharing and international and cross-border recruitment. And but I don't know if the UK has managed to kind of continue to work with that agency, that network of providers. But if not, I think that would be one of the kind of mitigations I'd certainly like to see happen.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you for that. We have no other questions in at the moment, and I'm sorry if I haven't seen anyone's hands up, so we'll give you a few more seconds just in case if you want to pop your hand up. But that's been really, really interesting, and I've really enjoyed that. So as you say, the report isn't out yet. When can we expect it?
Who knows? It's in the hands of the ILO. The buggers still haven't properly published my previous report. I've only just published it myself because I got fed up with waiting for them. So
okay, so if we want to look at your report, then we could access that, couldn't we? How would we go about accessing
I think if
report?
people want to see the most recent one, then
Yep.
contact me directly, because it has to be informal at the moment. But if the ILO don't pull out and publish the full big report, which is again will be very valuable, I think, and I've seen some of the chapters in it and they're very interesting. But if they don't get their fingers out, then I'll just put mine on ResearchGate or on the internet somewhere that
Excellent.
people can access.
Wonderful. That's good to know. Thank you very much for that, Dan. We've got lots of people who've said thank you very much. It's very informative. Mariam said thank you, Dan. Tracy said very informative. Thank you. I think Joe has as well, and I really have enjoyed that, and it's really it's good to stop and think about things, isn't it, and look at the bigger picture. I don't think we always get the opportunity to do that.
No, you're welcome.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's been a great session. Thank you for everyone who has attended today's IEP Live Learn Lunch. We've got, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think I'm a bit flustered because I've been waiting for my Wi-Fi to fall out at any point and it's not, so it surprised me. So as we can see, we've got the resources page up. Now, I'm not sure the hyperlinks will work for you, but what I can offer to do to anyone who needs them is if you contact me direct, if you'd like those hyperlinks sending out, I will get them sent out for you, and you will be able to do it. Miriam said, Dan, how do we contact you? If we would like to contact you direct, what is your email address?
Dan.finn@port.ac.uk.
Excellent. So I'll pop that in, Dan. Oh, dot fin at port.ac.uk. Yeah. Is it one F or two F?
Two Fs. Oh, sorry.
N, sorry, in fin.
Yeah.
One or two. Fin is two, isn't it? I'm just double checking before I send it. So there you go, everyone. Hopefully you've got that. If it doesn't work because of my typing, just get into contact with me and I will resend it, because I do have Dan's email address. That's wonderful. Susanna said, thank you very much. Great to look outside of the UK. And I really agree, Susanna, it is good to stop and look outside of the UK and see what's going on elsewhere. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for spending your lunch break with us. We really do love it when you join us and value the time that you spend with us. I look forward to seeing you all at next week's IEP Live Learn Lunch. If you haven't already enrolled, you will be able to get the link in the Learning Network e-bulletin that came out into your inbox this morning. And do, as I always say, if you've got any topics you would like us to cover, or things you would like us to talk about, experts you'd like us to find, contact me at helen.lee@iemployability. I've fallen apart today. What's gone on with me? Is it it's .org, isn't it? Is it .org? Emma, you're here, aren't you?
Yes, it is, Helen.
It is .org. What's going on? I've spent only 3 years with that email address and I'm struggling to remember it. All I can blame is the fact that I've been worrying about my Wi-Fi and it's frazzled my brain. So it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Joe, for joining us in what's late at night for you. And always wonderful to have you here with us. And thank you, everyone else. And I look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thanks, everybody.
Great to see you. Nice to see you, Dan. Take care.
And you, Joe. Enjoy the sun.